Hey, folks, welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us for this episode. Is Canada broken? A question that's been asked many times in recent years, probably because a lot of Canadians feel like that's the case. Now, I don't think Canada's broken, but certainly things are strained. And we are at a bit of a tipping point or a breaking point, you could say. A lot of that has to do with the big economic challenges we face right now. And yes, that's been exacerbated with everything that's happened this year. But it goes back further than that. I think for a lot of Canadians, a lot of younger Canadians, like that idea of the Canadian dream or a secure economic future is feeling more and more out of reach. Home ownership feeling out of reach or not feeling secure in their economic prospects. And going even deeper, we look at some of the regional disparities, the regional grievances and alienation that exist. We're seeing it for sure out here in the West, in Alberta. And, we might see another Quebec referendum next year as well. But I think even across the country, there seems to be less of an attachment to Canada, even though this year we have seen sort of a groundswell of patriotism in the face of some of the annexation threats from Donald Trump. So maybe a little bit of a paradox there. But increasingly, Canadians feeling dissatisfied with the direction of this country, and I think justifiably so. If you look back over the last decade, a lot of missed opportunities, a lot of policy decisions maybe gone wrong. So, what is it that's ailing Canada right now? What are the challenges we face, and what's it going to take to turn things around? Well, that's the focus of a really interesting and important new book out. It's called Breaking Point: The New Big Shifts Putting Canada at Risk. Its authors joining us on the Rob Breakenridge Show this week, we have with us John Ibbitson, writer-at-large with the Globe and Mail, and Darrell Bricker. He is Global CEO at Ipsos Public Affairs. John, Darrell, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks, Rob.
Good to be here, Rob.
It's interesting. It's been over a decade since the book, The Big Shift, which the title of this new book kind of refers to. So much has changed over the course of 12 or so years, including, of course, the Trudeau years, the Trudeau era. John, let me start with you. I mean, how much have things changed? How much has the situation in Canada worsened?
The situation has changed greatly. I mean, in the big shift, we said that there were powerful demographic shifts underway that would transform the political landscape. And those two shifts consisted of the growing power and population and economic influence of Western Canada, especially the Prairie provinces, which had a strong conservative base, and the power and influence of the millions of people living in the 905, the band of suburban cities surrounding Toronto, named after their area code. So we predicted that there would be a move towards a general, coherent conservative coalition, which would be competitive in subsequent elections, and that there would be some kind of progressive coalition that would emerge as well. That sort of happened. The Conservatives did win the popular vote in 2019 and 2021, but the Progressives under the Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau, with this increasing support of the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, governed for about a decade until the last election. We then wrote an essay in the Globe and Mail about a year ago, in which we said all of these shifts that we talked about were happening and growing in significance, but we had missed something big. We had missed the fact that the tectonic forces that were underway were at risk of breaking the country apart, and that Canada was in a state of crisis really unparalleled, at least since the Second World War. We are now using this gloriously mixed metaphor. We had kicked so many cans down the road that the chickens were finally coming home to roost, and that the arrival of Donald Trump as president forced us to confront these many kicked cans and confront as well the challenges facing the country.
So when we talk about a breaking point, Darrell, what's breaking or what's perceived to be wrong with Canada at the moment?
Well, I think that there's a number of things. John and I refer to them in the book as horizontal and vertical cleavages. Taking back from that old political theory of the 1970s and 80s about how Canada works and the old political analysis. I think it still applies, and those horizontal ones are the ones that we really understand from an intellectual perspective, but you also see them in terms of the way that the country operates on a day-to-day basis. And those horizontal cleavages are really the ones that relate to whether or not the individual regions in the country share much in common. And whenever we see situations like we saw over the last couple of days in Alberta, in which you see, not a small degree of focus on the question of Western separation, whether it's for or it's against. I mean, people are either booing or cheering the premier based on her positions on this issue. So obviously, national unity from a Western perspective is there, and as Alberta goes, to a certain extent, Saskatchewan goes, and we're now about to get into a situation in the province of Quebec, which we've seen kick off even more in the last little bit, in which they are going to be going through a provincial election through the course of this year, and going to be held next October, in which the likely winners based on current polling, but anything can happen in an election campaign, but the likely winners based on the most current information are probably going to be the Parti Québécois, which has said in the next few years they're going to hold another referendum on sovereignty. So that's the big cleavage that we usually deal with in Canada. It's how our political system was structured to deal with these kinds of things. The other cleavage that exists, the other breaking point that exists, is really vertical, and that's really between generations. And there's a group of the population in this country that have all the wealth, all the index pensions, all the best assets, and have had a tremendous success realizing the Canadian promise. And then we have another whole couple of generations, younger generations, that can only dream about what that is. And the frustration between these two groups is really starting to grow. So those are, I think, the two primary breaking points, but there are others.
Well, yeah, let's stay on the Western alienation issue. And coming off the heels of what we saw last week, John, this memorandum of understanding, does this possibly signal a different direction, a move away from this breaking point? Is this illustrative of a prime minister maybe who at some level understands these issues and these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the memorandum has huge potential. In some ways, it's almost as though Mark Carney read Breaking Point and then stole much of it, because he also is investing heavily in defense, which is a key priority for us in the book as well. But there's no question that if a private sector proponent is prepared to come forward, if Alberta and the federal government can continue to cooperate on lifting restrictions for that pipeline, if we can get participation by First Nations in British Columbia in the development of that pipeline, and in the sharing of the revenues and resources, and if we can get the tanker ban lifted so that the ships can proceed from a BC port with the oil from that pipeline, then we will have made a great step forward. But you will have noticed, I think there was 17 ifs in there between the conception and the execution. But still, if you were to say, is it positive or negative, we would have to say it's very positive. It reflects one of the great challenges that we set out in our book.
Yeah, I would say, can I add on that, Rob? I'd say that the question of what on this issue has never really been the sticking point. The question has always been how. So the easy part is we need capacity to get our biggest export to markets other than the United States. Well, I think most people, other than people who are very, very firmly focused on the belief that there's going to be a decline in the need for oil in the world, and climate change is the biggest issue, which, by the way, in Canada is a pretty minority opinion. Other than that group of people, most people agree on the what. It's always the how that's the challenge, and that's where we saw the meeting of the minds on the most obvious part of this, which is the what. I mean, that we need some capacity to get our oil and gas products to the coast. The problem is going to be with the why, and that's going to be the challenge that is going to be confronted by the prime minister. But at least this prime minister got to what. The previous prime minister could never figure out a way to do it. So he at least got to what. So then all of the sticking points are all going to be around the why. And that's where we'll see what kind of a political manager Mark Carney is.
Well, I mean, and Darrell, the prospect of, we think about 1980 as landmark in Canada, 1995, the Quebec referendums, the idea that 2026, we could see an independence referendum in both Quebec and Alberta, that's hugely significant and worrying.
Yeah, and that's what John and I, one of the motivations for writing this book. I mean, when we started into it, I mean, the basic things of the big shift, by the way, I will claim maybe more strongly than John that the big shift was actually very right on what was going to happen in politics. It might not have been right on the result, but the trends that are happening are still happening, the ones that we identified in that book. And some of them are just a matter of time. The question of the differences, when you start looking at it, the different places that the various provinces find themselves in this country in terms of their demographic construction, their economic requirements, their trading relationships, the products and services that they can bring to market, the health of their economies are so different across the country that it is always a wobbly thing to keep together. I mean, I'm just rereading Richard Gwynn's book on biography of John A. Macdonald, which everybody should read, by the way. It's 2-volume set. I think John and I both agree that it's brilliant writing. But he really shows what the issue is. How do we keep this group of former colonies together when they're in such a big diversity among the various pieces of the puzzle that is Canada? And right now we're coming up with probably the most broken time that we've had in Canadian history, because all the ones that you pointed to before, Rob, were all based on one question. They're all based on the question of how do you reconcile the interests of the province of Quebec with the rest of the country. Today, it's much bigger than that. Again, a political challenge for the Prime Minister and also for the premiers to find a way to keep this project going forward.
Yeah, John, what do you make of that? And I guess underlying where, look, Western alienation is not new. It's certainly been exacerbated in recent years to the point where we really haven't seen it in a very long time. Underneath all of that is something that we're seeing across the country where there's a frustration, there's a lack of attachment to Canada, the idea of Canada, especially among younger Canadians.
Yeah, and of course, at that very moment, along comes Donald Trump, who says, well, you're not a real country anyway. You should just become a part of the United States. We're going to wreck your manufacturing through tariffs, and we're going to put forward a proposal that you simply be annexed by us. And I think my generation is the elbows up generation. We're the ones who are saying, absolutely not. We love our country. We are not Americans. We have no desire to become Americans. But if you are a young Canadian who has no prospect of ever getting to own a home because we have priced them out of the market, if you don't even know what a defined benefit pension is, let alone have one, if you're working within the gig economy, and Americans come along and offer you a really good deal, perhaps, for example, converting your Canadian assets to American assets on a dollar for dollar basis, then polls show that a significant minority of people under 40 would be willing to consider that offer if it was good enough. That is a danger for the future of the country.
And you can even just see it in things like, John and I would still say Z. I'm sure you do too, Rob, but young people don't say Z, they say Z. I mean, the vocal frying and uptalk that comes from California that's now endemic in the way that Canadians speak English. This was something that used to separate us. Fewer and fewer Canadians say sorry, they say sorry. I mean, so you see, even in the artifacts of the way that we converse with each other, it's been so invaded by what exists in the United States. And why wouldn't it, particularly in the social media world, when you're not getting your messages about what's going on in your community, the world, or whatever, you're getting them through these huge tech companies in the United States. You're seeing your culture on things like TikTok. You're getting your music from there. You're getting everything from the United States. So for those younger people, you can just see it and everything about them. That the Canadian part of who they are, what is that now? And they're asking that question themselves. And when they're asking the question, they're not doing it with Zed.
Yeah. Well, look, Donald Trump kind of looms large in all of this. And I mean, we did deal with Donald Trump once before, but it's a lot different this time. And clearly, Donald Trump came to define what in a lot of ways was a historic election for Canada in 2025. But John, I mean, is Donald Trump just kind of a reflection of the problems in Canada? He's exposing some of these problems in Canada. How does he factor in here?
Yeah, that's exactly what we say in Breaking Point. In some ways, he is a catalyst. He arrived and pointed a finger and said, here's the artificial country that you are. Here's the border that makes no sense at all. Here's the state that you should become. And we have to have a response to that. We have to have a response that says, no, we are an alternative to the United States. We are a different place. We are a different culture. And we have to have that agreement amongst ourselves, generationally, as well as regionally. And we also need, I think now, to recognize the need for alternatives. And both the Carney liberals and the Poilievre conservatives would agree that we need to build the infrastructure required to diversify our exports into the Pacific and into Europe, as well as into the United States. It will always be our most important trading partner, but it should not really be our only trading partner. In fact, despite all the rhetoric, there's probably a broad consensus between the two political parties on the need to break down barriers in Canada to internal trade, and to remove regulatory hurdles, and to diversify trading relationships east and west, and if necessary, to build the infrastructure that makes that possible. So the good news is that there is something of a consensus at the political level as to how to respond to Donald Trump. That doesn't mean necessarily, though, that we will be able to meet the challenge of Donald Trump.
Well, when it comes to Canada's reliance on the United States or Canada's lack of defense spending, like all of these issues that Donald Trump has highlighted, the aggressive way in which he's portrayed it, he's not wrong on some of these points.
And that is the point. I mean, and that's the comment that John made before about the mixed metaphor, kicking cans and chickens coming home to roost. It's all true. All he did was he made it present. He made it clear. When we started the book, one of the things that John and I discussed was this comment from George Grant. Are Canadians a unique species on the North American continent? And that's basically what Donald Trump asked. And he said, how can you be a country if you're so dependent on us for your prosperity? How can you be a country if you can't even defend yourself? Who are you? And Canadians were, really offended by that, or a certain group of Canadians were really offended by that. But he's not wrong. And the challenge is the missed part of all of this is if we see this as a thing about Donald Trump. It's not. It's about us. And even if Donald Trump wasn't there, the horizontal cleavages and the vertical cleavages that we have in this country were coming to a breaking point anyway, even without him. And I think it would be missing the point if people only looked at this as an economic issue. In fact, the economic part of it is probably the easiest part to deal with. And you see our prime minister very focused on it because you deal with the easiest things first. The harder ones are the cultural ones, the defense ones, the reestablishing our identity. And my wife said something to me really interesting, because we were, believe it or not, John, we were talking about this morning. It was like, something really changed with the death of the Queen. And it's like, what? I never thought about it. But, the average person, one of the things that used to define us was we had this kind of royal thing. I mean, Quebec is a bit different, but, we had this attachment to whatever that was. There's a real break now. With after how many years, 50 plus years or even more than that, with the Queen as the sovereign, who people really had a positive opinion of. The King, they don't have the same response to that. So even that little thing is now wobbled. So all of these things that were supposed to keep us separate, they're all under threat. And this would have been happening, maybe not with the same degree of intensity, but it was coming whether Donald Trump was there or not.
Well, and John, is it a bit of a paradox, or maybe what we saw this year, the elbows up, was a little bit superficial? Because it seems a little at odds where there's this growing disenchantment, where people feel disattached from Canada, but we what felt like this groundswell of patriotism this year.
Well, there was an elbows up moment. Again, it happened. The great news for the Liberals was that it happened right around the time of the federal election. And it was largely, again, the people of our generation and people who were fighting for the future of Canada and for their own property values. But, what happened after that is also telling. So the great cry is to create a true internal economic union that would remove all the non-tariff barriers and make Canada as easy to trade with internally as externally. Where is that at? There's been some progress, but not a tremendous amount. The need for Canada to assert its control over its own territory, its sovereignty. There has been announcements of great increases in defense spending, but we're still going to wait to see how that plays out on the ground. We're also confronted with a huge problem that the country has faced. Again, nothing to do with Donald Trump, which was we broke the immigration system. The country that had been more supportive of large numbers of immigrants coming into the country, perhaps more than any other country in the developed world, now believes that immigration is broken. And there's a good reason for it. Immigration is broken. We allowed far too many temporary foreign workers and international students and asylum claimants into the country. So we're trying to get some sense of control over that and some sense of trust and confidence in that issue as well. These are all challenges, again, that happened irrespective of whether Donald Trump arrived or not. But they are issues that have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with now. Or if they're not dealt with and not dealt with now, then we really do risk some kind of fractures within the country.
I think on that question, the elbows up moment was an emotional reaction, perfectly understandable in the context. But are Canadians really prepared to be poorer over a long period of time in comparison to people who are on the southern side of the border? Are Canadians really prepared to have another country dictate what their defense policy is going to be, and they have no ability to do anything about it? Are they prepared to pay the amount of money that it's going to require to not be in that position? These challenges are considerable. And when we get into this question about what's going to happen with our national unity situation, I worry that we're a bit whistling past the graveyard on this. I think it is a fairly difficult set of circumstances that are going to be emerging in 2026 and 2027, of which Donald Trump is part of the question, and our relationship with the United States is part of the question. But missing what's going on in our own borders and the decisions that we have to make ourselves and what the costs are that are associated with that is going to put a lot of pressure on what being a Canadian is and what the cost of being Canadian is. And the question to me is, you're going to need much more than your elbows to solve this.
Well, and Darrell, I did want to ask you about the immigration issue, because I think this is something we can measure, both, as John alluded to, just how much things change in the numbers and how things kind of spiraled out of control for the Trudeau government, but just in terms of how Canadians feel about this, right? The idea of a consensus, which I think objectively once did exist, doesn't really anymore. What's changed in terms of Canadians' views and attitudes on this issue?
Well, I think John's comment is exactly the right one, which was Canadians feel there are too many people here, basically because there are too many people here. And, you can feel that way without being labeled a racist, which with the previous administration would certainly do. We have to look at this as a practical thing. It's about our heads, not just our hearts. And Canadians expect that we're going to have a very level-headed, intelligent, self-interested perspective towards immigration. And that's what they did not see in the previous administration. The current administration has moved a bit off of that. They moved a bit in another direction. They made some other announcements. But then again, one of the architects of this was Mark Miller, who they've just invited back into the cabinet, who's going to be in charge of Canadian identity. I mean, okay, so what's that going to be all about? So it's a delicate period that we're encountering right now. And I think the true face of what this Liberal administration on the issue of immigration is going to be, and how they're going to manage this and how they're going to manage the opinions of Canadians, is in development. We don't know.
This is not a partisan book. There's certainly criticisms and critiques of the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre in this book. At the same time, I mean, the policy choices or the policy neglect of the Trudeau government very much, I think, has shaped the moment we're at. And it's fair to criticize that record. A lot of this is an indictment, John, of the Trudeau government. How do you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we say that there are three things a federal government needs to do. It needs to manage the economy, it needs to keep the country together, and it needs to handle the Americans. And I think it's not a partisan statement to suggest that Justin Trudeau did not do particularly well in any of those three areas. I think the biggest problem that Darrell and I had with the government was its interference in areas of provincial jurisdiction. Justin Trudeau inherited a country that was remarkably united. The Bloc Québécois was in eclipse. Separatism was in eclipse. There was relatively little alienation and frustration in Western Canada because we'd had 10 years of a Western-based Conservative government. 10 years after that, with his moves on healthcare, his moves on pharmacare, his moves on dental care, and his imposition of the carbon tax on provinces that didn't go along with his approach to fighting climate change, all of those forces were back with a vengeance. And it proved what we believe to be a fundamental point that when the federal government interferes in areas of provincial jurisdiction by using its spending power to coerce them to do what the federal government wants them to do, it leaves the country broken and alienated and at risk of fracture. And that's exactly what we inherited after 10 years of Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Rob, John A. Macdonald got that. He got that point. This place is too big to be a unitary state. It's too diverse to be a unitary state. To make it work, it has to be a federal set of institutions. And in order for that to work, the senior partner in this whole process, the federal government, has to believe that too. And you never got the sense from the Trudeau Liberals, other than for the province of Quebec, that they ever accepted. And that has created the situation that we now find ourselves in. A decade of that has created, as John said, I'll put it another way, has lit a whole series of fires that were just embers. He's decided to put fuel and oxygen into these situations. He did, and he's created this blaze that we now see starting to build across the country.
Well, maybe it's not a surprise then, Darrell, that a Liberal who's distancing himself from Justin Trudeau is really markedly different than Justin Trudeau is. Well, certainly had some electoral success. So we talk about the election this year, but why haven't, do you think, the Conservatives been able to seize upon this moment, to capitalize on this disenchantment and this frustration and this disappointment of where Canada's at?
They got very unlucky. I mean, this last election was a fluke. Let's be clear. If Justin Trudeau stays as the prime minister and Donald Trump or Kamala Harris becomes the president of the United States, Pierre Poilievre would be the prime minister today. If the Liberal leader changes and it's Mark Carney and Kamala Harris wins the election, then Pierre Poilievre is very probably the prime minister of this country. The Liberals only won by 3. I mean, the seat count's a different total, but a different story. But the actual percentages of the vote, they only won by 3 points. So they came very close. They got the highest number that they've had since Brian Mulroney in terms of federal electoral vote. They just got very unlucky. And what's happened is that the Liberals have been very clever in figuring out, not just maybe by reading Breaking Point, or at least the things that John and I were writing before that, and other people too, but they also saw that the Aaron O'Toole platform really actually works, and certain elements of the Pierre Poilievre platform really works. Let's face it, the Liberals really didn't have a platform. They had a guy who was supposed to be very good, a person who was very good on one issue that Canadians, a particular group of Canadians, were really concerned about. So that's why he won. But as far as what policy content that he's come forward with, he's basically cleaved towards the Conservatives. So the bigger problem for them now is that what they had going for them prior to the last election has been taken away. And this other, the Liberal Party, quite smartly has moved back to the center of the political spectrum and done it by basically contagion from the right. They've taken over those policies that the Conservatives were suggesting in many ways. Not all of them, but in some pretty fundamental ones, like getting rid of the carbon tax was supposed to be, ground zero, the hill that the Liberals were going to die on, take it all the way to the Supreme Court. But now they've moved in another direction. So actually the difficulties for Pierre Poilievre are greater now than in some ways back then.
You agree with that, John?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, we said in the big shift that the Conservatives would be competitive in any federal election, and they have been. One of the things we say in the book is that Conservatives need to not take the wrong lessons from the last federal election, that their coalition remains coherent, and that they have fundamentally a proper understanding of the dynamics of the regions of the country, and that they have proper understanding of how the federal and provincial governments should work together. So they should, don't panic and don't succumb to the crazies. But they also have a problem, which is that Mark Carney has, as Darrell says, stolen so much of their platform that the police should have laid charges. And the challenge for any Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre or someone else, if he is replaced, will be to differentiate a Conservative alternative for the Liberals. That said, there are big economic challenges facing this country. And while we may be in a crisis with Donald Trump and tariffs, give it 6 months, give it 12 months, and you might find that Canadians are not thinking so much about tariffs on the border, but about interest rates, inflation rates, the value of their houses, or the weakening economy. So it would be very wrong for anyone to believe that Mark Carney is infallible. Come back in 12 or 16 months, you may find the situation is very, very different.
Can I just add one more piece on that, Rob, in terms of the federal political scene? The Bloc Québécois is the Bloc Québécois. They're going to get what they get. I mean, the Conservatives really aren't a factor there, neither are the NDP. So it's a fight between the Bloc and the Liberals. This looks like it's a sovereignist year, so that's a problem for Mark Carney because the Bloc probably is going to do better in the province because the Liberal brand is suffering. But let's not forget the NDP here either. And they're going to go through a leadership contest in March. Could they pick a leader that is any worse than Jagmeet Singh? It's possible. But I don't think they're going to make the same error twice. And the NDP got 6% in the last election campaign. They typically get around 15. The Conservatives need them to do better. Even if the NDP bleeds back 4 or 5 points from the Liberals, they're not coming from the Conservatives. They're coming from the Liberal Party. So that's the other problem that Mark Carney has. So everything that John and I have said that's praiseworthy about the fact that he's moved to the center and he's, taken his burglars equipment and robbed the Conservatives has opened up a great big space on the left for the NDP. There's potential that they could occupy that, and then Mark Carney ends up in the same squeeze play that Michael Ignatieff ended up in, or Stéphane Dion ended up in the mid 2000s. It's not a certain situation politically.
Well, let's end it on the central thesis of the book, right? Because this is not a book that says Canada is screwed. I think it's kind of a book saying if things continue down this path, we could be screwed. So how optimistic are you maybe that things are starting to change or that we can move away from the breaking point, John?
Well, I think things have started to change, as we've said. This federal government is moving in certain areas where we believe the federal government needs to move. But more important, as we say in the book, we have, a large chunk of the book is devoted to policy solutions that we've been putting forward. But the most important message that I think if we would want to deliver is we've been here before and we've come through. Right? Canada was created in Confederation as a response to threats of annexation by the United States. We fought in 2 world wars and were much feared by our enemies. We have been part of the major alliances that forged the Western Alliance. We built huge infrastructure from the Transcontinental Railway through to the St. Lawrence Seaway, through to satellites and beyond. So when push has come to shove, Canadians have risen to the challenge, and we're optimistic that they will rise to the challenge again.
And we're 2 Canadian patriots as well. I mean, and our basic view in the book is, the past is prologue. I mean, it does suggest that Canada has a way of dealing with this situation. And, the title of the book is not Broken Point, it's Breaking Point. And the reason for that is it's this moment. This is the moment of urgency. It's the moment in which we have to get serious about our future. And as 2 Canadian patriots, it's a cri de coeur to our fellow Canadians to say, don't pretend that this isn't happening. Don't ignore what's going on out there. This is the time. If we really believe in this country, we're going to have to make the sacrifices, by the way, which Mark Carney has asked for, but also we're going to have to make the personal commitment to believe that this country needs to exist. That belief needs to be behind it. And that means that we will be motivated to make the changes that we need to make. So Mark Miller is the new, heritage minister in Canada. If they follow the direction that John and I give in the book, I hope he enjoys Saskatoon because we say that department should move there.
All right. Well, we look forward to the next book in 10 years. Hopefully things are great. It's going to be a good title. In the meantime, the new book, it's called Breaking Point, The New Big Shifts Putting Canada at Risk. John Ibbitson, Darrell Bricker, thank you so much for joining us here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob.
All right, there you go. Once again, that is John Ibbitson. He is writer-at-large at the Globe and Mail, and Darrell Bricker, Global CEO at Ipsos Public Affairs. Together, they are co-authors of the book, Breaking Point, The New Big Shifts, Putting Canada at Risk. And a really interesting overview of this moment Canada faces, where we're at, and some of the roots of the genesis of the big challenges we face as a country. So I think an important book for Canadians and one that's already getting a lot of reaction. As it pertains to Alberta and to the West, it's going to be interesting to see where this whole issue goes. And we talked in the interview about this Alberta-Ottawa energy agreement signed last week. And this has the potential maybe to mark a bit of a turning point when it comes to all of these issues. Now, I don't know if it's enough to make the alienation issue go away or even make the separatism issue go away. And to that end, we'll see what the Premier decides to do. It was interesting, last week to see Danielle Smith very optimistic and upbeat about this agreement and talking about a new relationship with Ottawa, a new beginning with Ottawa. Of course, that agreement got a bit of a rough ride over the weekend at the UCP AGM. But the Premier did still get a standing ovation when she talked about other ways in which they might push back or stand up to Ottawa. And we saw that on Tuesday with the announcement from the Alberta government that they're going to kind of use the Sovereignty Act to essentially do what they can to try to obstruct the federal government's gun buyback program, which is linked to this ban on so-called assault-style weapons. What's interesting is that's not really an Alberta-Ottawa jurisdictional dispute. I think it's Conservatives in Alberta disagreeing, I think justifiably so, with what is a pretty bad federal policy. Provinces are justified in saying to the federal government, look, if you guys want to implement this policy, it's up to you to figure out how to do it. Don't look to us for any help. I mean, it's still unclear how the federal government intends on proceeding with this buyback program, which is essentially a confiscation scheme that would compensate gun owners for handing over these firearms that are to be banned under this new policy. But it's been a real mess already, and we've seen several extensions of the amnesty, and still unclear how this buyback program is going to work. But essentially, Alberta is saying to Ottawa, don't look to us for any help in trying to implement this, which again is their prerogative. I suspect other provinces may follow suit. But I think it's also still an example of where Alberta's Premier is looking for some instances where she can show her base that, look, we're fighting Ottawa, we're standing up to Ottawa. Can she have it both ways, to say it's a new beginning and a new relationship and this partnership on the one hand, and to say we're fighting Ottawa on the other? We'll see. I don't think, standing up to Ottawa on gun policy is going to jeopardize the energy agreement, and hopefully both sides remain committed to that. The other interesting aspect, and we spoke recently with Thomas Lukaszuk, of course, former MLA and cabinet minister. He is one of the founders of Forever Canadian, this group that was established to kind of counter the separatists. And they beat the separatists to the punch on the petition effort. And they more than cleared the bar under the citizen initiative legislation. Elections Alberta this week has confirmed that, yes, indeed, the petition is a success. It will now be up to the government to decide what to do. And this is where things get kind of interesting. Now, the question from Forever Canadian was meant to kind of turn the yes-no question on its head. Like, should Alberta remain a part of Canada? That if there is going to be a referendum, that at least it would be framed this way, as opposed to the question the separatists want. Now, because this petition has succeeded, it would seemingly block any attempt by the separatists to have their own petition, because there can only be one petition on a given issue. But the other wrinkle in all of this, the option that the Premier has under this policy proposal that Forever Canadian put forward. There's a policy proposal, legislative proposal, and a constitutional proposal under the legislation. With this, the Premier has an option of putting this to a vote in the Alberta legislature. This doesn't have to go to a referendum if the government doesn't want it to. Forever Canadian, Thomas Lukaszuk, that's their preferred path here, to put this to a vote in the Alberta legislature to affirm that Alberta should remain a part of Canada and to be done with all of this. Now, of course, you got the separatists who are saying, no, let's have a vote, which is interesting because, of course, they were mocking and dismissing Thomas Lukaszuk and Forever Canadian, that this was going nowhere. They weren't going to get the signatures. It was a distraction. They were focused on trying to get their own petition going. Now they're saying, well, this is great. Let's have a referendum. So does the Premier feel like she needs to, or she's obligated to give the separatists a referendum? Is she worried about the repercussions within their own party if she doesn't follow through on this? Now, look, I think this memorandum of understanding is a real blow to the separatist movement. that was already, I think, struggling to get anywhere near 50% support as it is. So referendum right now could be disastrous for them, and just the framing of all of this. And I think as you see the motivated, patriotic Canadians that this campaign illustrated, I think it just shows what an uphill battle now this especially would be for the separatists. So maybe that is one way of putting all of this to rest. But I mean, a referendum campaign is still, there's uncertainty, there's divisiveness, there's instability, that it projects. It's not a good place to be. So I think it's going to be an interesting decision for the Premier here and how she responds to the Forever Canadian petition and whether or not we get a referendum on separation or a referendum on remaining a part of Canada. So we'll stay tuned on how that all plays out. RobBreakenridge.ca is the website. You can find our podcast with Thomas Lukaszuk from a few weeks ago and a little bit more, I guess, on what they want to come of all of this. But certainly, it appeared to be a rousing success, and indeed, Elections Alberta has confirmed that's the case. So we'll see where these issues go from here. So as mentioned, the website, robbreakenridge.ca. Thanks so much for spending some time with us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.